Do you think there's a chance that Trump can win again in 2024?
Oh yeah, there's definitely a chance. I mean, it's very troublesome. The threat to democracy in America is probably the strongest it's been really since the Civil War.
Welcome to Downstream here on Novara Media. My name is Bastani. This week's guest is Francis Fukuyama, who memorably declared in his book The End of History and the Last Man, written in 1992, that liberalism was the ideological endpoint of human history, and that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Western capitalism had won. The book rapidly gained cult status and served as a kind of intellectual handbook for the post-Cold War era, its thinking shorthand for a now triumphant West. Like anyone, Fukuyama's thinking has developed since then, but one of the primary investigations of that work, liberalism as a political and economic orthodoxy, takes centre stage in his new book, Liberalism and its Discontents. Francis Fukuyama, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you very much.
Before we go any further, people are very familiar with your name. It was in my book, it was in my PhD, it was probably in my master's. I mean, this is the curse of your sort of celebrity. But despite that, I think people probably don't know that much about you sort of personally. Mm-hmm. So I thought I'd ask some questions, also sort of political questions, to delve a little bit deeper. What film best captures the end of history? Because there was a zeitgeist you caught in your book. Where is that in popular culture? We think that was the moment.
Well, I think a film that captured the end of history would actually be pretty boring. Because it would be just, kind of ordinary life in a liberal democracy. I actually really like dystopian science fiction movies. My favorite one for a long time was The Road Warrior, the original Mel Gibson one, and then the latest Fury Road that came out in, I think, 2016, in a way, it's not the end of history, but it's kind of the polar opposite, where resource scarcity has come back, and you have this return to a kind of barbarism. And I like movies like that because it's good to imagine what the alternative to the end of history is.
Who's your favorite president in a sentence, and why?
To be a little bit more interesting than someone like Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt was actually quite an interesting president because he was the one that kicked off the progressive era. He was the governor of New York. He chaired the first Civil Service Commission. I'm actually quite interested in bureaucracy and state building, and he was a big state builder because prior to his period, the United States only had a patronage service where everybody was a political appointee. So the idea that you should have a modern, skill-based expert civil service was very much associated with Roosevelt. I love the American West. I actually don't think there's anything beautiful in the United States east of the Mississippi River, even though I grew up in New York City and so forth. And he created the national park system, and so these unbelievably beautiful places out west wouldn't exist. I mean, they'd all be commercialized and terrible if it weren't for Roosevelt and his love of nature. So, he has a special place in my pantheon of great leaders.
That's a great answer. And who's the worst president? And you can't say Trump.
Why can't I say Trump?
Okay, you can say Trump. Is that in your opinion the worst?
Oh yeah,
US
I
president?
mean, without question. I think one of the most disappointing things in my lifetime has been that the American people could actually elect this idiot, president. I actually thought people had more sense than that, but, there he is. In fact, I have a hard time imagining somebody with worse character to be a national leader, of that stature. Even, the most imaginative, filmmaker couldn't create a character, I think, worse than Trump, in so many ways.
Did you not see him coming then in 2016? Obviously, he ran home with the Republican nomination, and I don't think anybody thought he was going to win the popular vote. But you're one of those people, presumably, like I think Huffington Post on the day gave him a 3% chance of winning or something. You just thought absolutely implausible.
I did think it was very implausible, and all the polls were showing that Hillary would win. So yeah, I was very devastated the day after.
So I guess in 2020, when you get COVID, all these massive challenges for him, obviously hostile media, and you would say justifiably, I would say justifiably, obviously his supporters would disagree, but it's a hostile media. Despite all that, you do get a really big turnout for him. He's winning states like Florida with these big ethnic minority groups, which are meant to be the sort of basis of the new Democratic base. I know Florida's quite unique, but just for argument's sake, what's happened in America where you can get that level of support for somebody who in your own estimation, has no right to even be anywhere near the White House or in contention?
That's a really good question, and I think it's one the Democrats haven't explored fully because in my experience, a lot of people that voted for Trump didn't vote for Trump, but they were voting against the Democrats, especially in these critical swing states like, Pennsylvania and Michigan and so forth. And I don't think that they appreciate, how toxic a lot of things the Democrats were pushing are, like defund the police, which I think has to be the stupidest political slogan anyone has ever...
But they weren't pushing that in 2016. I mean, Hillary Clinton's a very
I'm
moderate...
sorry, you're talking about 2016.
Yeah, well, both. I mean...
Well, the thing about 2020 is interesting because the turnout in many minority groups, including African Americans, was actually higher in 2020 than in 2016. And so that's something you really have to explain why, despite all of the terrible things that he did and how terrible a president he was, he still got a lot of people to vote for him 4 years later. And that's something that I think we fully haven't taken aboard yet.
When you say something like defund the police, and I'm sure that's unpopular with middle America, but when you started to say they are ambivalent or they dislike a certain set of policies or ideas or values that the Democrats stand for, in my head I think metropolitan elite. I know that comes with a bunch of that often means, certain things which are racialized and sexualized, etc. But they mean coastal elites, they mean the powerful, they mean effectively a political class broadly insulated from popular pressure, particularly in the sphere of economics for 30, 40 years, monetary policy, trade policy, etc. I mean, that's right, isn't it? I mean, there's been big mistakes made by the American establishment.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, I think actually that's what made me no longer consider myself a conservative, because the two biggest mistakes in the early 2000s were first the Iraq War and then the financial crisis, both of which were the direct outcome of, I think blinders that conservatives had on. First, the first was about the uses of American hard power, and the second was, the idea that deregulated financial markets would be self-correcting, and neither of those was true, and both of them, had disastrous outcomes. And I think that, 2016 and the populist surge probably wouldn't have happened in the absence of those big mistakes. So I'm the last person in the world that would say that American elites really know what they're doing and have guided the country wisely, and therefore any kind of populist reaction to them is unjustified. I don't think that's true.
Do you think they've corrected since then? Because obviously you've got this huge scare of Trump. He almost wins again in 2020. Do you think Washington and those same elites, and I say liberal elites, they encompass both parties to an extent, or the political center of the country? Do you think they've had a sufficient shock and you say, never again, and they've course corrected, or are they still not making the changes they need to?
I don't think so. I mean, the issues are a little bit different. I mean, in some areas they've course corrected. So I think that nobody is ever going to argue for the kind of, free trade based globalization that emerged, by the time you got to Obama, that had been supported by a whole series of presidents, where, multinational corporations search for every little bit of efficiency by outsourcing whatever they can. I think that period we're probably not going to go back to. But, a lot of the issues that drove people crazy in 2016, 2020, I think are still not, really resolved.
Do you think there's a chance that Trump can win again in 2024?
Oh, yeah, there's definitely a chance. I mean, it's very troublesome. I think that the threat to democracy in America is probably the strongest it's been really since the Civil War, because, something like 70% of Republican voters believe Trump when he says that the election was stolen in 2020. And as a result, Republicans all over the country have been trying to change not just voter access rules, but the way that the vote is counted such that they could award the electors in the 2024 election to a Republican if they don't get a sufficient popular vote. So it's completely anti-democratic initiative that they're undertaking. And if they do that, and it's a close election, I think the chances for violence are pretty high because both sides are really energized on this issue, and I think it's a big danger to the most fundamental democratic institution, really, which is the ability to vote and then have a peaceful transfer of power, may not happen in 2024.
In your book, you put a lot of this down to, which we'll come to shortly. You put a lot of this down to new media, social media. But I want to sort of draw out the continuities between the problems you've just highlighted there, the potential problems there, and what's happened in the past. So there's clearly a significant minority of US citizens who have bought into an alternative reality. I mean, that's indisputable. But when I think about, in the years after 9/11, I think at one point something like 70% of Americans thought that Saddam was guilty for the Twin Towers attacks. You've got the 2000 election, which I think, Greg Palast, the journalist, covered it really well at the time, particularly here in Britain with Newsnight and The Observer. There's a really good argument that Bush never won that election. Some very strange things happened. I think there was a relative calling the results that night on Fox News and so on. Just very things you wouldn't expect in democracy. So I wonder, to what extent then are these issues you're talking about a fundamental rupture with the United States of the early 2000s, or are we just seeing them a bit more now? Because Stop the Steal was crazy, but I mean, maybe so was the Florida count in 2000. It's just we didn't have people recording on iPhones and so on.
I don't think that's really, well, look, the polarization started really in the 1990s. And the polarization is really what's driving the cognitive disagreement, that it's a different model. People don't take facts in and rationally process them and come to conclusions. They start with the conclusions and then they select the facts that they want, that will support their conclusions. That's really, I think, the mental process that's going on. And so there's this prior polarization that's led people to, pick the facts that they want, and the internet has made that much easier to do. However, Trump made it much, much worse because, every American election has irregularities. The 1960 election that brought Kennedy to power, it looks like, there was a lot of tampering with the vote in Chicago. And, so it's not as if this is a new thing, but to just outright make up a story about massive voter fraud sufficient to swing an election by which the winner won by 8 million votes. I mean, that's just something without any precedent at all. And to support a violent insurrection where you occupy the Capitol on January 6th, that's also pretty much without precedent. And so I do think that, Trump personally has made things much, much worse than they were. And they were pretty bad, to begin with.
Yeah, I guess I asked that because obviously if Trump is a sui generis figure, if he's a one-off, then that's a good thing, right? Because then obviously once he's departed the political scene, whether that's this year, 4 years, 10 years, you get a relative return to normality. But if he's an avatar for something deeper, which you're saying sort of begins with the polarization of the 1990s, it's obviously a different challenge. Why did it start in the 1990s? And who would you blame? Is that the result of sort of certain political ideologues who were pressing things, taking opportunities from the right? Was it the center taking their eye off the ball, thinking that, actually we don't need to work with labor unions anymore? If you're going to apportion blame for that polarization, who are the culprits?
Well, there's several levels of analysis. There's that political layer, and in the political layer, most people would blame Newt Gingrich, who led this Republican House majority that was opposed to Bill Clinton. And, really, I think, coarsened the nature of American politics by just declaring all-out war on everything the Democrats did. But the sociological and economic changes under the surface, I think, were more important drivers of this. And it was really one of the consequences of the kind of globalization that we were engaged in because the old class divisions were replaced by a new one in which it's really level of education that determined how you were going to vote. And so in every state in the union, even in the red states, the state capital or the place where the state university is going to vote blue, solidly Democratic. The rest of the place will be red. And you get this map in which the single biggest correlate of how you're going to vote is population density. And that's kind of a new word. And that's not just in the United States. This is going on in a lot of different countries. But this is, I think, the product of moving into a kind of post-industrial world. One of the really big changes is in gender relations because, the fact of the matter is in a world in which physical strength, upper body strength is not that important, everybody's sitting in front of a computer screen, women just do better. You look at college attendance rates. I think nationally in the United States, 60% of undergraduates are women. They graduate at a much higher rate than men do. So they've been replacing men in many occupations, up and down the road. So this is just one aspect. So it's, changing demographics in terms of ethnicity, changing gender relations, and it's made a lot of people, especially white men, without good educations, feel very insecure. And I think that's one of the big drivers of, that's one of the big demographics that has been in support of Donald Trump.
Who's a bigger threat to liberal democracy? Because you've got this focus on new media. Joe Rogan or Tucker Carlson?
Oh, Tucker Carlson, without question. I mean, well, look, I have to confess, I don't really regularly listen to either of them. But I do think that Tucker Carlson has just become completely toxic. I mean, he's one of these people who, if a Democrat takes a position, he takes the opposite, regardless of the merits of the position. And I think this business of supporting Putin is just the best example of this. Republicans cut their teeth on opposition to Russia and being more hardline than the Democrats. And he's completely thrown that out the window because, he wants something to hit Biden with. And that level of toxicity is really just extraordinary. Whereas Joe Rogan, he kind of tends to favor more conservative, and puts anti-vaxxers on and that sort of thing. But I don't think he's deliberately setting out to poison the national discourse the way Tucker Carlson is.
Yeah, I mean, just for the record, I'm not a Rogan, skeptic. I don't think he should be deplatformed or anything. It's just an interesting debate. But what Tucker Carlson says, I mean, it's immensely popular with a significant swathe of the electorate, and it cuts through. I mean, I watch him virtually every day, just the clips and stuff that you see. Yeah. And he's obviously very good at what he does. Like you say, he gets whatever the Democrats are saying, and he gives a relatively compelling, sort of emotionally congruent set of messages. And you say, okay, this is internally coherent in some way. But Trump in 2016 and 2020 is going to places which, was, like you say, staunchly opposed to the Soviet Union, the electorate. These were major issues, core issues, right until the 1990s. And now he's saying, look, we need to be friendly with Putin. And they support him. I mean, there's not a volte-face I can think of in terms of a domestic electorate's views on foreign policy. I can't think of another one. It's like saying in 10 years' time, we should be best friends with Al-Qaeda, and actually the Taliban are great trading partners. So... And I'm not drawing an equivalence between the USSR and the Taliban. It's just that's the sort of shift in in preferences. So, I mean, again, what explains that? Because I mean, it's easy to say, and this is what the Beltway says. 70 million people have just gone crazy. But I mean, that can't be it.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm saying that you don't start with policy preferences and then vote for the candidate that supports your policy. That's what. This is the fairy tale that political scientists tell themselves about the rational voter. They want the candidate to win, and therefore whatever the candidate says is what their policy preference is. And so I think people are actually much more plastic or moldable than people think, particularly in foreign policy, because people really don't have particularly fixed views. This was true actually even, the whole period of the Cold War. You couldn't get a majority of Americans to say that we should defend Germany if attacked by the Soviet Union. But the elites, were pretty consistent, and there was a bipartisan support for that position, so people kind of went along with it. But now you're in this very confusing moment when the elites are saying very, very different things, and it's driven more by your domestic policy preferences rather than by any coherent view of what the outside world is like.
That's so interesting. So the idea that there's the elite consensus has collapsed on foreign policy, which has created this vacuum. I suppose you sort of see microcosms of this. So like when Trump said about John McCain, who was obviously shot down over Vietnam, was a POW for years, and he said, I prefer my war heroes not to be caught.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he says the most extraordinary things, and I don't think you need to be a political scientist to presume that's going to not play well with the Republican base, but it never did.
Yeah, that's right.
How's that possible? Because these are deep instinctive things, Republican Party, the military. I mean, it's...
Yeah, you would think so, but in a way, people admire Trump for being disruptive and being willing to, take these really outrageous positions. And I think this is this owning the libs phenomenon. They really like upsetting people on the other side. And if it upsets them, to insult John McCain, then they're gonna do that. This is in general what I've learned about politics over the last few years. That if you want to know things that have surprised me, is that people are really, the psychology of politics is really pretty complicated, and it is this cognitive process of having, not having stable preferences, but really following a kind of social psychology where siding with your team is more important than what you would normally think of as long-held policy preferences. So free trade, out the window because Trump says it's not a good thing. Similar kind of revolution. And so I do think that rather than looking at policy preferences and kind of rational voters, that you really need to consult a social psychologist as to what sorts of personal needs is this kind of followership fulfilling in individuals, and why do they feel this psychological need, rather than trying to explain it in terms of, policy outcomes.
Yeah, I remember the LRB did a great piece, the London Review of Books, did a great piece about Brexit. And the argument was that large numbers of people voted for leaving the EU because they didn't think anything can change. So there's no downside. Like you say, you trigger the libs and nothing changes anyway. Yeah. Things broadly stay the same, which is an ideological claim, which comes out of sort of 50, 60 years of unprecedented peace. Interesting. But the idea that owning the libs, because it explains tens of millions of people, maybe. What do you think of the new generation of conservative influencers and pundits, people like Stephen Crowder, Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro? Do you think they're injurious for a sort of liberal body politic? Because they're not even trying to play by the rules very often.
No, they're terrible. It's kind of the decline and decay of, civil conversation, where you get these, entrepreneurs who make names for themselves as influencers simply by being outrageous. I think it's really not healthy. And again, it reflects more of this social psychology that you want to show your loyalty to the team rather than, take any serious effort to grapple with policy problems and outcomes that you might prefer.
So do you think the US should go down the route of China and say, don't have a great firewall, but you say, look, we're going to build in certain political affordances. So for instance, in China, they've removed the idea that you can accumulate likes and things like this. Do you think that maybe there's a role for the state to change the incentive structures for these things? Because they don't seem positive.
This is a really complicated question, because I think that to the extent that the state gets in the business of moderating content on the internet, you set a very dangerous precedent. Right now, we've kind of settled for a situation in which we delegate that to these big platforms. And I don't think that that's a particularly good outcome either, because I don't think they've got either the capacity, but more important, the legitimacy to do that kind of moderation. I have some ideas about alternative ways you could deal with this problem, but I think that neither of those approaches is good, least of all the Chinese one, where you just have the government, say what's acceptable and what's factual and so forth.
I say the Chinese example flippantly, but I think because for us in the West over the last 30, 40 years, it's such a major thing. The idea that a state would say to a private enterprise, you should do this or that. It seems so, wow, that's incredible. But it's also quite reasonable. For instance, the bans on pornography or the time limits on TikTok for people of a certain age. For instance, should a 9-year-old be able to use TikTok more than 3 hours a day? That's actually policy debate we probably don't have in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that the state would put a limit on that, it's acted similarly before on various things. You couldn't access certain goods and services until a certain age. Are we just maybe in the wrong mindset here? Because actually Western liberalism shows us a bunch of policy steps that we're no longer pursuing.
Well, I think that there have always been limits to First Amendment freedoms. I mean, we have a much stricter First Amendment than you do here in the UK, but it's always been limited, as you say. So the FCC prevents stations from broadcasting hardcore pornography, over the air, and they've done that. But I think that in those cases, or terrorist violence or incitement, to violence, I think in all those cases, there's actually a pretty strong political consensus that this is something we want to have happen. But when you get into these really complex political judgments about, at what point does your commentary on vaccine safety veer over into, deliberately fake news, that's a pretty complicated thing where the state, I would not really trust the state to make those judgments. And I think the design of a good institution, really depends on it not mattering who's in charge of that state, for those judgments to work.
You distinguish classical liberalism, which is this quite capacious thing, encompasses the United States and Sweden, to neoliberalism. So what's the difference?
Well, neoliberalism, the way I use it, refers really to the extension of economic liberalism to an extreme that I think became self-defeating, that started really in the late 70s and 80s. Politically, it was supported by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but it also had an intellectual base, at the University of Chicago with economists like Milton Friedman or Gary Becker, or George Stigler, who all were pro-market, but I think distorted policy by really being anti-state as a result. And the policies that this led to, were things like the deregulation of financial markets that led directly to the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, were vastly, destabilizing, and I think created a lot of the inequality that has been driving the populism that we saw in the 2010s.
And what about public ownership? So, for instance, in this country, Margaret Thatcher prioritizes everything.
Yeah.
Presumably you agree with some of it, disagree with some of it. Can you explain sort of where neoliberalism goes too far?
No, I think that, there's no reason that the British government should own, British Telecom or British Steel, because those could be operated by a private operator just as well. But, certain public utilities are really natural monopolies, and all over the world there is an effort to privatize waterworks or, sewerage systems, things like that. And also they were done improperly. I mean, one of the biggest scandals was Telmex. This was a state monopoly on telecommunications that was sold off to Carlos Slim, and they converted basically a public monopoly into a private monopoly that was unregulated. And as a result, Slim turned out to be one of the richest men in the world, and Mexican telephone prices are still way too high. So it's both the method by which you do the privatization, and it's also the nature of the asset that's being privatized that makes a difference.
So in this country right now, as across Europe, as across the world, but particularly in Europe, energy prices are rocketing. And the center left in this country, where the left is saying, well, we should bring energy companies to public ownership or a big share of the equity so that we can have more control over prices effectively for the consumer. The Conservatives are saying, no, we'll interfere in the market, which obviously is good, but we're not going to do that. And the Labour Party was formerly committed to public ownership and now is kind of like, oh, we'll increase VAT or something. But from what you're saying with regards to natural monopolies, it sounds to me like, I know left-right doesn't make sense all the time, but it sounds to me like on this issue, you're more to the left than the Labour Party. Because you're saying it's a natural monopoly, there's a good argument for public ownership, which is something that's kind of anathema right now.
No, I don't think that energy is a natural monopoly. I mean,
so what would be a natural monopoly then?
Well, something like the water and sewerage system in a big metropolitan district where you're not going to have competing firms laying, pipes to everybody's home. There really can't be competition in that that kind of a situation.
How about rail? Because obviously you can't have multiple or you can't have multiple buses on the same. I mean, you can, but I've never seen it work. So how about public transport?
Yeah, I think that is a case where you probably could, have a public ownership more easily because competition becomes less effective. I mean, there are ways of getting around that, by forcing companies that own the tracks to open them up to, to others. But it's very hard to regulate that and manage that effectively. So that might be better owned in public. But the, oil and gas, it's such a global market. What they produce is so fungible, and there's so many players that I don't think, it really qualifies as anything like a natural monopoly.
So on buses at least, you agree with, say, something like Andy Burnham. That's something. What I'd say is, this was always make me laugh. When people are waiting for a bus, I can't. Who thinks, oh yeah, you know what? I'm not going to get this one. I'll wait for the one that's 5 minutes time because it's better value. More. No, you want a regular, affordable, efficient bus service.
Right.
So when did Reaganism and Thatcherism go too far? Because you're saying that they addressed some problems, but then they exacerbated others. I mean, what's the balance sheet here? Was Reaganism and Thatcherism a failure? Because if these revolutions did precipitate this rise of populism, and that does lead to the end of liberal democracy, and in your book you quite clearly say that's not the case. You don't think America's going to descend into armed violence. But if it did, I mean, that's quite a big legacy for those two, given the status they've had in our politics for the last 20, 30 years, which has generally been positive.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the record is a very mixed one. So I think some of the big privatizations that Thatcher, promoted were justified. I think that Britain really didn't have any business, being a coal mining power, and her fight with the miners' union was I think she was on the right side. But other things, the worst thing that really happened, I think, was the progressive deregulation of financial markets. This began in the late 80s. In the United States, there was a legislation called Graham-Leach-Bliley that basically allowed these big banks to expand and become universal banks, and repealed the Glass-Steagall Act that had formerly, that was the Depression era bill that limited the size of banks, and as a result, they got very, very big, and they were allowed to take huge risks by the regulators, and as a result, you had, this disaster unfolding in 2008, and that, really powered a lot of populism because a lot of people lost their homes, banks foreclosed on their houses because they couldn't afford to pay. The people owning the banks did really well after a year or two of turbulence, but the ordinary people didn't. And that was politically very toxic.
In the book, you talk about the alignment of liberalism and democracy. And you say, look, you can have illiberal democracy, you can have undemocratic liberalism. Mm-hmm. When I look at US foreign policy, less so now, but in the sort of apogee of the sort of Cold War era, the 50s with Guatemala, with Iran, Mossadegh, mm-hmm. It's quite clear that the commitment to liberalism in a narrow sense, which is private property rights, don't touch them, that clearly trumps democracy to the extent that it wasn't just undemocratic, it was anti-democratic. So like the removal of Mossadegh in Iran, I think is arguably the worst political misjudgment of the 20th century, given what happens, 25 years later. Mm-hmm. What's your feelings on US foreign policy, particularly in that era, 1950s?
Yeah, no, you're not going to get any argument from me about any of that. I think that we overestimated the security threat from the Soviet Union, and that forced us into bed with a lot of very unsavory characters. And, it really led to a use of a policy instrument that tried to reach into the inside of these developing countries and manipulate their politics in a very non-transparent way, which itself is not something that a democracy really ought to be doing. Mossadegh was bad, but overthrowing Arbenz in Guatemala is really responsible for a lot of the terrible history of that country, and then the Civil War, because we backed really a bunch of thugs because they were our thugs, and so that's a very unfortunate legacy. And it was one that we were hoping to leave behind once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended. But then you get the war on terror, and it means that you're going to support the Ethiopians because they're going to be fighting, Al Qaeda, and so a lot of those trade-offs, are still present. I think not to the same extent as during the Cold War, but you're absolutely right that was a bad period in U.S. foreign policy.
So to an extent, the US is still making the same mistakes. To an extent.
Well, I guess the thing about democracy in American foreign policy is that it's never been the primary goal to which all other goals are going to be subordinated. And so we, have had a good relationship with Saudi Arabia for, decades. And Saudi Arabia is certainly not a democracy. Most Americans have reconciled themselves to it, because they thought they needed oil from the Persian Gulf. And so there have been these trade-offs that have been made over time. I think that, it leads to these charges of hypocrisy, but it's hypocrisy only if you think that the only goal of American, just because American presidents praise global democracy, that's their only objective. I mean, they do have other economic and security objectives, and sometimes they need to be balanced against one another.
Do you think runaway economic inequality destroys liberal democracies? Obviously, you've seen in the last couple of years, people like Bezos, Musk, their wealth is running away from median incomes.
Yeah, I think that you have to have a certain level of equality of outcomes to preserve liberalism. And that's why just a purely liberal regime that's not linked to democracy and then to demands for those kinds of redistributions isn't going to work, because you're going to end up with a wildly unequal system, and people are not going to find that legitimate.
So that could end liberal democracy if unchecked, you think?
Yeah, well, so this might sound a little bit surprising, but over time I've actually become something of a social democrat, in the sense that I actually think that that kind of redistribution and provision of universal services to people is necessary to sustain a liberal society.
Because that's a big jump, not from you, but sort of mainstream thinking in the 2000s before the financial crisis was, well, look, we don't care how rich these people get. If the median income goes up, if life expectancy is going up, if access to various goods and services is improving, what's the problem?
Right.
But you're saying actually there's a massive overhead there.
Yeah, there's a massive overhead. The other thing that may not have been anticipated is just their use of their resources in politics. It's amazing the number of really, really rich Americans that then fund really right-wing causes, and it always amazes me how rich Americans are. But it means that we're not in a situation of one person, one vote. I mean, certain people get a lot more votes than other people because they can turn their resources into political power.
So what would you do about that? I mean, you're sounding a bit like Bernie Sanders here in the assessment. So what's the response?
Well, we've got a really big problem because of our Supreme Court that declared that spending money in politics is protected under the First Amendment. But I think a normal democracy would do what a lot of European democracies do, which is put limits on campaign fundraising and spending and lobbying and so forth. You can't ever wring all of the money out of politics, because it usually finds another way of getting into the system. But I think other democracies have rules for keeping money out that we could apply to our system and make it a lot more fair.
So would you have something like a top rate of tax, which is just unthinkable now, kind of extortionate, sort of 1960s level taxes? Do you think you'd say, well, look, nobody can be worth more than 100 billion or something, because this just buys so much political power? Or do you?
I'm not sure that gets at the core of the problem. The other thing is that a lot of the really, really rich people, like Jeff Bezos, are rich because they actually did something pretty remarkable. It's not like he inherited all this money from his father and then, wasted half of it, but still has all this money left. I mean, he really created something of tremendous value. And so I think, as a matter of principle, I'm not comfortable with simply saying, you can't get richer past a certain point. You can certainly increase the progressivity of taxation in the United States.
I just think when you have people worth potentially 200 billion, it's less of a problem in Britain. But I think in the US in particular, it's small change to that guy to give a media organization $20 million to say,
That's
look,
right.
just press this one agenda, LGBT, not that he would do this, LGBT rights or tax or whatever. And like you said, they can just warp and distort the market for information so easily. And
That's
I think
true.
this is such a huge problem I think it's probably the biggest problem for democracies, and particularly for America.
Yeah, so the question is, do you want to reduce that threat by simply reducing the incomes of these people, or do you want to try to regulate the way they can spend the money? And I would prefer to regulate the way they spend the money.
Britain, much less important on the global stage than the US, but it's a British audience that we've got. Are we a democracy? I mean, we've got a queen, we've got a monarchy, we've got an unelected second chamber. I mean, how broad is this term? You're a political scientist. Yeah.
I think that all democracies have features that are not based on popular choice, right? So we don't have the people control monetary policy. You know, we appoint specialists to do this. We have bureaucrats that deliver public health and you know, social security and a lot of other services that are not directly elected. And you know, you have to have experts in government. I mean, I think if you leave decision-making up to people, ordinary people, they don't have the time or the expertise to really, you know, consider these very complex public policy problems. So every country has got a mix of that. I think that the question you really need to ask is, if a government really screws up, is there a fundamental mechanism by which it can be held accountable by a broad part of the public? And in that respect, you know, you've seen several revolutions taking place in Britain because people voted out of office, the current government. So in that respect, you know, that I think that's probably the most critical characteristic of a democracy that means that it is still a democracy.
So you think Britain is a democracy? Because if we had a country trying to join the EU tomorrow and they didn't have an elected head of state and their second chamber was unelected, we say, sorry, you can't join the EU because you're not a democracy. But it's just because it's this historic European great power that we say, oh, well, it has to be a democracy because it's kind of this weird, you know, it's like an intellectual palindrome. All Western European countries are democracies and all Western democracies look like Western European countries. And it's like, well, analytically, possibly not.
I think, you know, you want a liberal democracy in the first place. And I think Britain really qualifies in that respect. You know, Britain really invented, in a sense, the rule of law, and it's still a very powerful force in this country. And I think that, you know, is a pretty important qualification because that's exactly what people like Viktor Orban are trying to, you know, weaken. So Britain has more going for it. You know, the fact that there's an unelected head of state doesn't matter because the Queen doesn't have any power, really. You know, effective power really still lies in representatives and a prime minister that is the result of popular choice. So,
but do you think people like Johnson and Trump are sort of like a gift to people like Orban? And this is something I worry about a lot. And actually, it feeds into a question I'll ask shortly about China, which is there's a great talk by Eric Lee on TED about the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, look, there's no critique of it, but it's quite a compelling story about how, look, we promote people who are effective problem solvers. And it strikes me that we don't do that with political parties in liberal democracies. We're clearly not promoting the likes of Priti Patel and Boris Johnson and Donald Trump and these people on the basis of their ability to solve problems. We're electing celebrities, journalists, party bag carriers. Do you sort of sympathize with the argument that where we are right now with liberal democracy is kind of the best advert for these authoritarians? Like they can just point at us and go, look, you don't want to be like that. Or what is this even about? This is a charade, this system they're claiming to sort of evangelize over.
Well, look, Eric Lee I've known for a long time, and I really don't like a lot of his arguments. I mean, the issue is if you move to a more authoritarian form of government, how institutionalized is it going to be? Because the problem really with that kind of government is that people in power don't accept limits on their power. And we've already, so, you know, he's right that the Communist Party in China developed a lot of rules so that you got a mandatory retirement age. You used to have a 10-year term limit on the senior leadership in the Communist Party, and those were all good features. It is true they've got a system for vetting younger leaders and raising them up. But first of all, how many authoritarian countries actually have that kind of a system? I would say almost none of them, right? Your average Middle Eastern or African dictatorship, just, you appoint your cousin and that's, that person's going to be the defense minister. And secondly, in China, it breaks down, This is a system that was created under Deng Xiaoping after they started the reforms, but the Chinese have what they themselves call the bad emperor problem. You create a powerful executive with very few formal checks and balances. If you have a good emperor, like I think Deng Xiaoping was, you can do amazing things much more quickly and decisively than a democracy can. But if you get a bad emperor that makes bad decisions, you get, the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution or some of these huge disasters in Chinese history. Now, is Xi Jinping a good emperor or a bad emperor?
My next question, yeah.
I don't think that he has been as bad as some of the historical bad emperors in Chinese history, but he could. He could make very bad decisions in the future if he really faces a system that doesn't constrain his power in any way. And that, I think, is the weakness in that system that Eric Lee doesn't really have an answer for.
Final question on a global scale, picking up from that. You've obviously got a belligerent expansionist, Vladimir Putin. I personally bought a lot of the argument that, we need foreign policy realism and that would placate him to a significant extent. I no longer think that. And I think actually the people who spoke about the sort of ultra-nationalist ideologues and so on, they're far more influential and powerful than I think we realise. I certainly didn't realise. You look at Russia, you look at China, you look at India with Modi, you look at the potential of Japan to go to the right with the Liberal Democrat Party. I mean, that's a long way off, but it's eminently plausible. Are liberals losing the fight for the world's soul, I suppose? Because we say, the global community, we generally mean the European Union and Australasia and the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is more than half the world's population.
Yeah.
Or is it just not a sufficiently appealing politics? Vladimir Putin is not offering rising living standards and autonomy and freedom. Do you think necessarily by virtue of the politics these people have that they'll fail? Or could they triumph? Could we descend into a era of darkness?
They could succeed. I mean, if the Russians had planned their intervention in Ukraine a little bit better, they could be in a pretty good position to unseat the current government and put in a puppet and so forth. China certainly, doesn't look like it's going to fail in the short run. So these are countries that we're going to have to deal with. I do think, however, that we've gotten a little bit cynical about liberalism, and we have kind of secretly agreed with Putin that this is a kind of obsolete doctrine. This is the doctrine of your parents' or grandparents' generation. We need to replace it. And that's why I wrote this book, because I think actually it remains a better system than any of the alternatives, and that you're inviting a lot of domestic violence and international aggression if you move away from, a rules-based, rule of law, liberal society. But, we need to buck up a little bit. And in that respect, I think the whole Ukraine war has had a good side. I mean, obviously for the Ukrainians, it's been horrible, but it's had a good side in that it's reminded people of why a liberal society is not obsolete and why it's better than an unconstrained dictatorship. And I think that's a lesson that maybe every generation has to learn it, in its own way. And hopefully this will be a little bit of a lesson to the current generation.
I mean, I'm a socialist, and I've often read, and it's in your book as well, I'll read the literature which is critical of liberalism because I find it interesting, like Patrick Deneen and so on. And some of it's really food for thought, and some of it's quite coherent and persuasive. But the idea that anybody other than the individual is best placed to determine how they want to live their life, I just think, what's better than that? What's the sell here? Unless, civilizationally, what we return to like 13th century Europe or something. Yeah. And I don't really get how that has mass appeal. I get how the critique can have mass appeal, but propositionally, I'm not so sure. So we've talked about politicians who are failing or who have failed, who out there, global leader or somebody on the rise, strikes you as somebody who, gives you hope about the future of politics?
Well, look, that's too easy a question right now. I mean, obviously Zelensky has become everybody's darling. It's interesting, you were saying earlier that we elect all these, celebrities and comedians and actors and so forth. This is a half-serious point. There's something to leadership that actually does require a kind of skill that an actor has, because you want to inspire people, you want to communicate with people, and you want to do it in a way that is not highbrow but appeals to ordinary people. And Zelensky has managed to do that. I mean, he appears in his T-shirt, unshaven, because he's a wartime president, and he kind of knows how to play that role beautifully. And as a result, he's attracted, my Ukrainian friends have said that they've never in their lifetimes seen the country as united as it is now. And right up until the invasion, people were still criticizing Zelensky for the way that he was handling, the Russians and the negotiations and this and that. But once they came under severe threat, he's their guy. And I think it's, actually quite inspiring to other people as well.
I mean, that's because he sort of gets and that's something I think a lot of liberals forget, because obviously liberals in the West tend to be sort of procedurally minded, but he gets inevitably, because he's in a war, but he gets the theatre of what he's having to do. And like you said, it's a really decisive part of politics, which I feel people like Hillary Clinton, I don't know Hillary Clinton, but it seems to me from her 2016 campaign, for instance, they never really grasped. No. And I think that the centre-left hasn't grasped for a long time. Maybe Obama, actually. I'm being fair. He was a very theatrical figure. We've spoken a lot about where liberalism's failing. Where's it succeeding? What liberal societies are doing really well at the moment?
Well, actually, I think Germany, among modern democracies, is doing pretty well. Germany had a lot of problems coming out of the Second World War that were fundamentally cultural. The culture had been shaped so much by Prussian militarism that had disastrous impacts, and their project was basically to turn their own citizens into really liberal subjects that were tolerant and open, to difference. And they succeeded. I mean, some Germans complained that they spent too much time teaching about the horrors of the Holocaust, and it got kind of repetitive and the like. But it worked, and you can see actually the effectiveness of this when you added East Germany after unification, where the communist governments had pretended that they were tolerant and had new citizens that were above nationalism. But right now in Germany, the AfD's homeland is in these old former East German lands that had never really successfully inculcated liberal values in their own citizens. Now that means Germany's got a problem, with that party, but it is a remarkable cultural change that came about. It was a little bit too successful because they also turned most Germans into pacifists, at least of a certain age, which meant that they really couldn't live up to their responsibilities, in terms of European defense. But now that seems to be changing under the pressure from Vladimir Putin. So I think that was a pretty good success story.
Francis Fukuyama, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much.